They said it was impossible. A black man with no formal education, working in a basement lab while the world doubted him. But on a sweltering day in 1953, he held in his hands something that would save millions of lives. A discovery so revolutionary that surgeons everywhere would soon depend on it. This is his untold story. Before we begin, if you believe untold stories deserve to be heard, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications because today's story will change how you see history. And please, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Let's make sure brilliance is never forgotten again. The year was 1930, and America wore two faces. On one side, progress and innovation. On the other, a color line drawn so deep it split the nation's soul. For a young black man in Nashville, Tennessee, dreams were dangerous things. They could lift you up in the morning and crush you by nightfall. Vivian Thomas knew this truth better than most. He was 19 years old, standing at the edge of greatness, smart, ambitious, with hands so steady they seemed made for precision work. He'd saved every dollar he could, working as a carpenter's apprentice, building cabinets and staircases for white families who never looked him in the eye. The money was for Meharry Medical College. He was going to be a doctor. It was all planned out, all within reach. Then 1929 came like a thief in the night. The stock market crashed. Banks closed their doors. His life savings vanished like smoke. The dream of medical school died that October, and with it, a piece of Vivian's heart went silent. He took the only job he could find. Janitor. Vanderbilt University Hospital. $12 a week to mop floors and empty trash cans in the building where doctors worked miracles he would never perform. Every day, he walked past operating rooms where white men in clean coats saved lives. Every day, he went home to a segregated neighborhood where brilliance meant nothing if it wore brown skin. But fate has a strange sense of timing. Dr. Alfred Blalock needed a laboratory assistant. Someone with steady hands and a sharp mind. Someone who could follow complex instructions and work long hours for almost no pay. The job posting said technician, but it paid like a janitor. Most educated white men wouldn't touch it. Blalock's eyes fell on the quiet young man who mopped his laboratory floor. Vivian Thomas was hired in 1930. Neither man knew they had just formed a partnership that would change medical history. At first, the work was simple: cleaning instruments, preparing solutions, taking notes. But Blalock noticed something. This young man didn't just follow instructions. He anticipated them. He didn't just clean equipment. He understood what it was for. When Blalock explained a procedure once, Thomas remembered it perfectly. When he showed him a technique, Thomas could replicate it with those impossibly steady hands. Within months, Thomas was performing complex surgical procedures on laboratory animals. He was developing new techniques. He was solving problems that stumped trained surgeons. But the world saw only what it wanted to see. A black lab assistant, a technician, a helper, nothing more. The indignity was constant and crushing. White medical students, fresh out of college, walked past him without acknowledgement. Doctors asked Blalock questions about techniques that Thomas had invented. He trained surgeons who would go on to earn 10 times his salary and receive honors he would never touch. He worked in a basement laboratory while the men he taught operated in gleaming surgical theaters upstairs. But Thomas kept working because he knew something they didn't. He knew he was brilliant. In 1943, the world was at war, and Dr. Blalock moved to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, taking Thomas with him. A new laboratory, new challenges, and then a crisis that would define everything. Babies were dying, hundreds of them. They were born with a condition doctors called blue baby syndrome. Their skin turned blue from lack of oxygen. Their tiny hearts couldn't pump blood properly. They gasped for air that their bodies couldn't use. Most died within their first year. Parents held their children and watched them fade, and medicine had no answer. The greatest minds in surgery had tried and failed. The anatomy was too complex, the hearts too small, the blood vessels too delicate. Operating on an infant's heart was considered impossible. Attempting it was seen as reckless. Babies died, and doctors called it God's will. But Blalock had an idea, a wild, dangerous idea. What if they could reroute the blood flow? Create a new pathway? Give those struggling hearts a chance? The theory was sound, but the execution was everything. One wrong cut, one trembling hand, one miscalculation, and a child would die on the table. Blalock turned to the one person whose hands never trembled. The one person who could see solutions, where others saw only impossibility. "Vivian," he said, "I need you to figure this out." Thomas went to work. Night after night, in that basement laboratory, he operated on dogs, recreating the condition, testing approaches, failing, trying again. The surgical technique had to be perfect. Every stitch had to hold. Every connection had to work. He filled notebooks with observations. He modified instruments. He invented new tools because the ones that existed weren't good enough. The white doctors upstairs discussed theory. Thomas, in the basement, created reality. He worked for months, 200 experiments, 200 attempts to perfect what everyone said couldn't be done. His hands moved with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Cut here, stitch there, clamp this, reconnect that. Slowly, impossibly, he developed a procedure that worked. But there was a problem. A massive, insurmountable problem. Thomas wasn't a doctor. He had no medical degree, no credentials, no letters after his name. In the eyes of the medical world, he was still just a lab technician. A black lab technician in 1944 America. He couldn't publish the research under his own name. He couldn't present it at conferences. He couldn't even stand in the operating room as an equal. Everything he'd discovered, everything he'd created, would have to be given away. The question hung in the air like poison. Would any of this matter if the world never knew his name? November 29th, 1944. A 15-month-old baby girl named Eileen Saxon lay dying. Her lips were blue. Her fingernails were blue. She weighed 11 pounds and had maybe weeks to live. Her parents had begged every doctor they could find. Johns Hopkins was their last hope. Dr. Blalock agreed to attempt the surgery. The procedure Vivian Thomas had perfected in 200 experiments. But Blalock had never performed it himself. Not once. He'd watched Thomas work. He'd read Thomas's notes. But his hands had never made those cuts, placed those stitches, created those connections. The operating room filled with surgeons, all watching. This was history in the making, or a catastrophic failure that would end careers. The stakes couldn't be higher. A baby's life hung in the balance. And standing on a step stool behind Dr. Blalock, looking over his shoulder because he wasn't allowed to stand as an equal, was Vivian Thomas. The surgery began. Blalock made the first incision, and immediately Thomas leaned in. "A little higher," he whispered. Blalock adjusted. "Smaller cut. You'll need to dissect more carefully here." Every instruction came from Thomas. Every movement was guided by his voice. "Clamp here." "Not so deep." "Angle it this way." "Watch that vessel." The room grew tense. This wasn't how surgery worked. The lead surgeon didn't take instructions from a lab assistant. But Blalock knew the truth. Thomas had done this 200 times. He had done it 0. For 90 minutes, Thomas orchestrated every motion. His voice was calm, steady, certain. His eyes never left Blalock's hands. When the surgeon hesitated, Thomas guided him. When a complication arose, Thomas solved it. When success seemed impossible, Thomas made it real. And then, it was done. The connections were made. The new pathway was complete. They waited, holding their collective breath. Eileen Saxon's lips began to turn pink. Her fingernails lost their blue tint. Oxygen flooded her tiny body. Her heart, aided by Thomas's innovation, pumped life where death had waited. The operating room erupted in whispers of amazement. The baby was alive. The impossible had happened. Dr. Alfred Blalock would be hailed as a genius. His name would appear in medical journals worldwide. Surgeons would call the procedure the Blalock shunt. Universities would give him awards. Royalty would seek his expertise. Vivian Thomas went back to the basement. Over the next few years, the technique saved thousands of babies. It revolutionized cardiac surgery. It opened doors to procedures doctors had never dreamed possible. The Blalock shunt became standard practice in hospitals around the world. Thomas continued his work in obscurity. He trained the surgeons who came to Johns Hopkins to learn the procedure. They stood at the operating table while he stood behind them, whispering instructions just as he'd done with Blalock. They learned from his genius, then went out into the world with their credentials and their degrees, never mentioning the black man in the basement who had taught them everything. He was paid as a janitor until 1946. When he finally received a raise, it was still a fraction of what the doctors he trained were earning. He had no office, no title, no recognition. Medical journals described innovations he'd created without ever printing his name. The injustice was staggering. But Thomas kept working. Because babies were living who would have died. Because medicine was advancing. Because excellence, he believed, would eventually speak, though they never fully crumbled. And at Johns Hopkins, young medical students began asking questions. Who is that man in the laboratory? Why does he know more than the attending physicians? Why isn't he listed in the research papers? The whispers grew louder. The truth, so long suppressed, began to surface. Vivian Thomas wasn't just a lab technician. He was the architect of techniques they studied in textbooks. He was the genius behind breakthroughs attributed to others. He was, in every way that mattered, one of the greatest surgical innovators of the 20th century. In 1971, Johns Hopkins University did something extraordinary. They awarded Vivian Thomas an honorary doctorate. The man who'd been denied education because of poverty and prejudice stood in academic regalia and received recognition from one of the world's most prestigious institutions. But the moment that broke him, the moment that brought tears he'd held back for 40 years, came in 1977. Johns Hopkins commissioned a portrait. Not unusual for the institution, which honored its great contributors with paintings in its halls. But this portrait was different. It showed two men, standing side by side as equals. Dr. Alfred Blalock and Vivian Thomas, the surgeon and the technician, the credited and the forgotten. Together, finally, as they should have been from the beginning. When Thomas saw it, he wept. 47 years after he'd first entered that laboratory. 47 years of brilliance hidden in shadows. And now, on the walls of Johns Hopkins, his face hung alongside the man who'd received the glory. Recognition had come. Late, but it had come. Vivian Thomas died in 1985. By then, his techniques had saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Babies who would have died gasping for breath grew up to have children of their own. Cardiac surgery had transformed into a field of miracles, built on foundations he'd laid in a basement laboratory with 200 dogs and hands that never trembled. The medical community finally acknowledged what should have been obvious from the beginning. Without Vivian Thomas, modern cardiac surgery might not exist. Without his genius, his persistence, his refusal to let prejudice diminish his excellence, countless innovations would never have emerged. But here's the haunting question. How many other Vivian Thomases were there? How many black scientists, inventors, doctors, and engineers had their brilliance stolen or buried? How many contributions to human progress were lost because society decided that skin color mattered more than capability? The answer is too painful to calculate. Vivian Thomas's story isn't just about one man's triumph. It's about a nation that almost wasted extraordinary genius because of the color of the hands that held it. It's about excellence that persisted despite everything designed to crush it. It's about the difference between the world we have and the world we could have had if we judged people by their minds, instead of their melanin. When we erase people from history, we don't just dishonor them. We rob future generations of inspiration. We tell brilliant young minds that their contributions don't matter. We perpetuate the same prejudices that held Vivian Thomas in a basement, while lesser men stood in the spotlight. But when we remember, when we tell these stories, when we insist that every contributor to human progress deserves recognition, we do something powerful. We correct the historical record. We inspire the next generation. We prove that brilliance cannot be buried forever. Vivian Thomas never became the doctor he dreamed of being at 19. But he became something perhaps more important. He became proof that excellence doesn't need credentials to exist. That genius doesn't require permission to flourish. That one person, armed with steady hands and an unbreakable spirit, can change the world even when the world refuses to see them. Today, the Vivian Thomas Medical Arts Academy stands in Baltimore, training the next generation of healthcare professionals. His name is spoken with reverence in medical schools worldwide, and somewhere a surgeon saves a child's life using techniques he pioneered, carrying forward a legacy that almost died in obscurity. That's the power of remembering. That's why these stories matter. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to history you didn't know, then please, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because there are countless untold stories that deserve to be heard. Share this video with everyone you know. Post it on social media. Send it to students, teachers, anyone who believes excellence should be recognized regardless of who achieves it. Leave a comment telling us about other forgotten heroes whose stories need to be told. Let's build a community that refuses to let brilliance be buried. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for making sure that names like Vivian Thomas are never forgotten again. Because when Black brilliance defied the odds and made history, it didn't do it for glory. It did it because lives mattered more than recognition. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all.